All right, so I did not get to finish part four, so I guess technically this is part five, but it shouldn't take me super long to finish this up because my internet, I basically had to shut down my Chromebook at home. Anyways, so I want to go ahead and get this finished so I can get it uploaded. I've also had, anyways, okay, so it's been a Monday on a Friday, which does not bode well for the weekend. Anyways. So Iwo Jima. So I was giving you the details about Iwo Jima. And again, what to say? Like, I mean, there's so much more interesting stuff to say about Iwo Jima, and the fighting that went on and the incredible conditions. It took about a month to get all of that under control. There's just not time to go into it. And honestly, it's not really on the standards, right? The standards, mention Midway, they mention D-Day, they mention Pearl Harbor, and they mention the atomic bomb, but they don't really tell you much about Iwo Jima, and I think that's a terrible shame, because one of the reasons why we make that commitment, the reason why we take the step of the atomic bomb is because of the incredible death and destruction that happened on Iwo Jima. You have to understand that the Japanese people were very clearly, they had been, propagandized, right? They had been told essentially that the Americans were going to do all kinds of horrible things. They had also been raised to believe that surrender is not an option, that surrender means you're less of a man, that kind of thing. And so there's, they are very determined not to give up. And so you have, this is not just the Japanese soldiers, this is the Japanese people. If you look on this map here, Iwo Jima is an island that's very close to Japan, and this is why they want it, right? So they can have these bombing campaigns directly on Tokyo. So what's going to happen is they will go from Iwo Jima here to Okinawa, and then and the idea is that Okinawa is going to be the staging center for the invasion of Japan. But the fighting on Iwo Jima is so awful and so intense, and you can see this is a map of the island, very small. This is Mount Suribachi. And so that picture, the quintessential Marines picture that we see of the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima, which of course is, if you know anything about flags of our fathers, there's actually two versions of that. The first one, the flag was much smaller, and so they took it down and they raised the second flag, and it's the picture is actually of the second flag raising. But that is the famous, Marine Memorial, which I got to see that in Washington, D.C., and that was incredible. So just incredible bravery, and the fighting on Iwo Jima was awful. And it's that fighting that begins to make, especially when Truman comes in and he's trying to make this decision about using the atomic bomb, that makes the atomic bombs seem like a viable solution, because he knows how many Americans were killed. He knows how dug in the Japanese soldiers were, and understand that the Japanese had trained their women, their children. They had sharpened bamboo sticks. They were going to fight to the death. This is kind of, and so unfortunately we don't have much time to really go into that. The other thing that kind of happens, especially if you're thinking in terms of the morality of the atomic bomb, and there's many people that second guess the dropping of the atomic bomb, because if we look backwards with presentism, we can see that the atomic bomb created the nuclear war, sets the stage for the Cold War. The Cold War is going to set the stage for conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, and by extension, really in the Middle East. And so because we see the Cold War as kind of being the trigger for these other events, we want to say, well, we shouldn't have dropped the atomic bomb. But understand that the decision that's a way oversimplification. So here you have kind of this incredible fight on Iwo Jima, this incredible casualties. We get control of Iwo Jima, so we now have a landing strip for the B-29 bombers, and we start significantly bombing. Tokyo, and we start using napalm, right? This jelly gasoline. to basically set these uncontrolled fires, burn everything to the ground. And these are incredibly hot fires. I mean, not nuclear bombs, of course, but these are fires that you can't control. You drop them, and they're very hard to put out. So, lest we sit up in an ivory tower and think, oh, well, nuclear bombs are so terrible. Understand that what we were doing with the bombing campaigns were pretty awful, too. War is awful. There is no way to make war moral. And, sadly, that's, there's good wars. There's the concept of a just war, and then there's the concept of bad wars. But at the end of the day, when you're in the process of fighting a war, the goal is to defeat your enemy. And you don't defeat your enemy by playing nice. I mean, you guys can imagine playing a football or a basketball game or a baseball game, or even going to any competition and saying, "Oh, well, I want to beat you, but I don't want to make you feel bad beating you." Well, no, you don't want to. Nobody sets out to want to destroy people, but in the concept of war, you have to defeat them, and you will defeat them by any means necessary, because if you don't kill them, they will kill you. And so it's a whole different level, and it's very easy to be critical of the dropping of the atomic bomb. And so I just want to point out that we've got this issue about the firebombing and the bombing campaigns. And it's also at this point in late 1944, early 45, that you see the kamikaze attacks. Early on in the war, you don't have kamikazes. The development of the kamikaze attack with Japan is the product of the lack of resources and the fact that the United States is closing in on Japan, and we're getting closer and closer and closer. So, sorry. Again, like I said, it's a Monday on a Friday. This shows you some of the strategic bombing, the firebombing campaigns, and again, it does some major damage in Japan. In the meantime, we start to plan an attack on Okinawa. Of course, the interesting thing there is you have an increasing number of casualties from Iwo Jima. So you should have this grasp that the closer we get to Japan, the more American casualties they are. 12,000 American casualties. Compare that to D-Day, for instance. And that's part of what I think is so awful about the lack of attention we pay to the Pacific campaign. We focus so heavily on Europe, so heavily on the Holocaust, so heavily on D-Day, that we don't realize what incredible feats happened in the Pacific campaign. And Iwo Jima and Okinawa are great examples of that. And again, when Americans do it right, we just, like the bravery, the intense sacrifice, it's impossible to watch anything about Okinawa or Iwo Jima and not be completely motivated by what's going on. And I really strongly encourage you. There's, if you have HBO Go, you can do the Pacific as a series on that. There's all kinds of stuff out there. You absolutely ought to watch some information on the Pacific campaign, because I'm telling you, it will leave you speechless. And it will make you appreciate Veterans Day in a way that, in a whole new way. So be sure you understand kind of this move. The closer we get, the increasing casualties. We take Okinawa, and again, Okinawa is not on the standards, which appalls me. This begins to show you some of the kind of the conditions. Again, these are constant beach invasions, right? Now there are different types of beach invasions, because the way the Japanese fought was very different than the way the Germans fought. But it's just still incredible. Just some images, from fighting in World War II. So the issue is that the Japanese want to maintain their emperor, right? They don't want to dismantle their emperor. And at first the idea was, and I misspelled unconditionally. Gee, I should have proved this. Sorry. So they want to keep their emperor, and the emperor, actually, there's some indication that he was beginning to consider surrender. I think more important, I don't know, this is just me kind of shooting from the hip. I think he just wanted to stay in power. So he starts to realize that they're going to lose, right? Now, the military has kind of that samurai mentality. They're willing to die for it. But I think the emperor is thinking bigger than that. And most Americans, while they want unconditional surrender, they also want the they want the war to be over because they're tired of watching their soldiers get killed, right? And so that's one of the things that's really kind of, that's a sticking point initially, right? The Americans will kind of issue a warning to the Japanese that says, hey, we have a weapon, we're going to really make it hurt. But the emperor is not able to get the Japanese military to go along with surrender, at least not until after the dropping of the atomic bomb. So understand that this is kind of where we are, especially when you're talking about this period that happens after VE Day in May of 1945. So as we're moving past VE Day and Europe is closed and the U.S. is still fighting in the Pacific, there's discussions about, everyone knows it's going to be over. The question is when and how many more casualties. And so this is what everyone's talking about. And so, it's just the Japanese, digging in and the military refusing to surrender, basically. So again, understand the Manhattan Project. This is the name of the program to build the atomic bomb. And of course, there's a whole backstory to this. One of the videos that I'm playing on here today on Friday is the 10 Days That Changed America and the letter from Albert Einstein. And there's a whole backstory to the atomic bomb as well. Just you need to be sure you're familiar with the term Manhattan Project, the concept of innovation, the concept of that the U.S., that there was a debate about the atomic bomb. There were people, including Truman, that weren't sure, is it moral to drop a bomb, that were not 100% sure what's going to happen. We're not 100%, this is going to affect a lot of casualties, a lot of civilians. Is this the right thing to do? And there's scientists that are very upset about it. There's, there's people that believe it's worth it, right? At the end of the day, Truman is going to end up doing that because he wants to protect American lives. I think it's interesting that Truman will drop the atomic bomb to get the Japanese to surrender in order to protect American lives, but you'll see that he backs off from using it. And in fact, most presidents want to avoid the atomic bomb. The only president that was somewhat favorable, and I say favorable, kind of not meaning he really was an advocate for it, was Eisenhower when he becomes president, because this is the guy that led the fighting in Europe, right? He knows what it is to send young boys to their death, and so the one thing he sees about the atom bomb is that it does tend to make people step back a little bit. But at the end, but really we know that if you drop an atomic bomb, it's going to create so much destruction. And so we create this weapon, we use it to end World War II, and it does create the Cold War, right? This fear about the atomic bomb and who has the most and all that kind of stuff. So understand this is a very important, innovative development. It's an important war development, that there's a moral debate behind it. And so you need to be kind of familiar with that. Now, obviously, we first tested in July of 1945, so we don't wait very long, before we use it. But that's kind of the pressure that ending World War II and getting out of the Pacific, had brought us to, because there's so much concern about what's, about what's right and what's wrong. So they do, again, this all goes back to American casualties, and this, that whole notion right there. Again, August 6th, you have the dropping of the little boy on Hiroshima. August 9th, you have the dropping of Fat Man on Nagasaki. I believe, if I remember, Nagasaki was the second choice. I don't remember what the first choice city was, but something about the weather. And so the Enola Gay, if you ever get a chance to go to around D.C., just outside of D.C., is the Smithsonian kind of annex museum, and they actually have the Enola Gay plane there, and it's just like, it's incredible. Like, you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is the plane. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. And of course the casualties end up being, the consequences end up being way worse than anything we ever imagined. Hello. And sorry, had a buzz. And so you have have a real dramatic change after that. Now understand that part of what's going to prompt Truman to drop the atomic bomb is that you have the Potsdam Conference that happens in July. I think it's July, June or July. I think it's July. of 1945. And this is the first time that Truman will meet Stalin. And when he meets Stalin, he's basically, but at this point, first off, Stalin is not even preparing to have democratic elections in these territories like Poland and Eastern Europe that the Soviets had swept through. And in addition, he hasn't declared war on Japan yet. And so Truman's like, dude, the war in Europe was over in May, and here we are in like July, and you haven't declared war yet. And so there's some frustration there. And so Truman, part of his decision making is not just American casualties, but it's the concern that the Soviets are not going to hold up their end of the bargain and that the U.S. is going to continue to fight this war on their own. And so that's, this is another reason for dropping the atomic bomb, is that you have this very disappointing Potsdam Conference, and you have this clear sense after Potsdam that Stalin is not going to be easy to work with, that the promises and the deals that he had reached with FDR are not going to be upheld, and there's kind of some pressure there, kind of from foreign policy, and so that's another piece of why we dropped the bomb. So be sure you're kind of familiar with that. So you want to know that that's in August of 1945, and that's what basically forces the surrender of the Japanese, right? The military can no longer justify what's going to happen or justify continuing the war. Now, what's interesting is that we will allow the emperor to stay around. And part of that's because, like I said, that Potsdam Conference goes so badly that the United States realizes the Soviet Union is not a friend, right? Oh, they were willing to play friends as long as, Germany was fighting them. But now that Germany's defeated, they're going to be very two-faced, and we're going to see what their real colors are. And so one of the issues with Japan is that we need, and remember Japan's proximity to the Soviet Union, to that far eastern side of the Soviet Union. And so we need to have a justification to keep troops. We need to have a justification to have an ally. And so we start to play nice with the Japanese, despite the atrocities they commit, despite the POW camps, despite the massive casualties and the terrible fighting that happened. The scope, you start to see the influence of the Cold War before the Cold War in the way we resolve things with the Japanese, because we want to we want to have that kind of base to keep an eye on the Soviets. And so that's going to really change our perspective. And I think that has a much bigger impact on the way history has been written about World War II and that kind of thing. Now, after we drop the first atomic bomb, the Soviets will declare war, right? Because there's kind of this sense of, oh, they really are going to use that weapon. We better make sure that we're still friends with them. And of course, they declare war. So by the time you get to August 15th, between the atomic bomb and all this kind of stuff, the agreement to allow the emperor to remain, they unconditionally surrender, although the U.S. does say, well, the emperor can stay around. So again, Russia finally kind of gets on board a little bit, but it's very clearly that the bad relationship is starting at the end of World War II. So you want to just kind of keep that in mind. You also need to know August 45 is the end of World War II. And kind of this transition from World War II into the Cold War. Famous picture from Life magazine. We don't know who those two people are, but if you know anything about kind of how awful the fighting was for, is the United Nations. This is another concept that pops up on the standards quite a bit. This has to do with kind of creating a national organization to help resolve disputes, right? And this is a variation of Woodrow Wilson's idea that we need a global organization, that we can kind of talk things out, right, instead of just constantly declaring war on each other. And so the United Nations has some differences. The United States supports, and the bell just rang, so I guess I'm going to stop this, and there will be one more short one.